B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. This is a post-retirement special episode for Thursday, January 7th, 2021. Your humble host has been maintaining radio silence. Hasn't been easy. But I felt the events of this week, including the change of the guard at the U.S. Senate and Trump's inciting of a mob invasion of the Capitol, deserve comment. Now, I want to thank all the people who've emailed or posted on Facebook. I think of Joe Davis, Jay Cryer, Faith Peoples, Patrick Fasano, Carl Howard, Ian Berman, many people who have challenged me to break that silence. And so I don't expect this to happen very often, but I do want to offer you a podcast. Shelley Stark also was telling me that she missed my voice. So let's just dive in here. What we saw in Washington yesterday was the culmination of Trump's ill-fated reign over these United States. If you go back just 4 years to his inaugural speech where he talked about American carnage, well, he delivered. He delivered quite effectively, if you consider that to be a good thing. And Trump, who has trampled norms and precedents, broken the law brazenly, violated the Constitution, operated as a corrupt figure, proudly? Well, his nonstop mob rallies, as recently as this past Monday in northwest Georgia, have groomed and conditioned a mob mentality of a righteous despot. And they are oblivious to the contradictions. This is the group that is pro-life and pro-gun. And they're for law and order, but they are personally exempted because they are patriots with a righteous cause and rationalizations that are endless. And because their mission is to cleanse America from the evils of the libtards, who they have been told over and over again hate America, want to turn it into a socialist, communist nation. All these are political messages that culminated in their weaponization yesterday. And while the mob did recede, and the business of the joint session to certify the results of the Electoral College did go forward, ending at 3:30 a.m. early today, Thursday. What we saw was an insurrection devised and promoted by the sitting president. He's been inviting his mobs to Washington for weeks now. And he manipulated those who are conditioned to believe his lies as, well, there may be some bullshit there, but, we generally agree with his posture. And because he's against them, we're with him. And I've been warning about the dangers of this for months and years. And after the November election, I tried to warn you as my listeners that Trump had not yet hit bottom. Well, yesterday we saw the bottom, and it's ugly. It is very ugly. And we also saw the pivot of many of his key enablers, who are now deploring the violence that occurred without naming the man who stoked it. And that includes elected officials, media figures just driving over here to the secret studio. I heard Sean Hannity rationalizing all this and saying, oh, it was only a 1%. Just a fringe group. We'll get to this in a bit. They want to blame Antifa for the antics that were clearly driven by Trump and executed by his supporters, his rabid supporters. So this has led first yesterday to calls from pundits, members of the public, for the invocation of the 25th Amendment, which is a way to remove a president who is unable to perform his duties, either due to incapacity or, I don't know, there are other factors that are listed in the law. And it is gaining some traction. Earlier today, Speaker Pelosi and the man who will become Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, he won't have to keep chasing those cameras. They'll be chasing him. Anyway, they issued statements saying that if the vice president will not lead the invocation of the 25th Amendment, that they will proceed to an historic second impeachment of Trump. Now, this is hot rhetoric. It has attracted support from virtually every Democrat in the House and, remarkably, only a handful of Democrats in the Senate so far. But with less than 2 weeks to inauguration, it's hard for me to imagine that Congress can move that quickly. Now, they had a joint session convened last night, and they could have just jumped the whole set of hurdles, introduced articles of impeachment on the House side, and when the Senate came over to report its votes on the failed efforts to challenge the result of state reports of electors, theoretically, they could have impeached Trump on the spot. But when you look at the vote count in the House on the challenges at Arizona and Pennsylvania's elector results, 135, 140 Republicans all stood up for their failed leader. And it's breathtaking. As we'll mention in a moment, this has become the pivot point for key Republicans. But there's still plenty of diehards who rode Trump into power, and they hope to retain or gather even more power by being stalwarts of Trumpism. One of the few exceptions is House Republican Adam Kinzinger of Illinois. He said the president has become unmoored not just from his duty or from his oath, but from reality itself. But once again, this is primarily a Democratic maneuver, and it's very hard to see that it will lead to that outcome. Now, there are a couple of variations here. If we start to see more Republicans supporting either the 25th Amendment, which requires a 2/3 vote of each House, or impeachment and removal, which requires that 2/3 vote of the Senate, something could happen. But I'm pretty skeptical. Now, from what I'm aware of the impeachment law, it is possible to impeach a president after his term is over. It's obviously a way of just settling a score, leaving an historical marker, and trying to set an example for future presidents not to try to be a despot. And after the House and Senate completed their action at 3:30 a.m. Washington time, I don't know if Trump had been up all night watching, keeping a list of those who turned on him. But a statement was issued because he couldn't tweet. And the statement was, even though I totally disagree with the outcome of the election and the facts bear me out, nevertheless, there will be an orderly transition on January 20th. And that echoes the video that he released in the middle of the occupation of the Capitol, where, of course, he continued to argue that the election was rigged. He was a victim again. And somewhere buried in there was a message to be peaceful and to go home. And if Trump's effort here was simply to paint himself as a victim, because that's preferable to being painted as a loser, maybe in his twisted, bizarre way, he achieved his goal. And that victimization played out in his mob rally in Georgia the night before the election, where I was surprised, actually, at how much time he spent talking about Senator Kelly Loeffler and Senator David Perdue. In the past, when he's held these rallies to endorse others, they get about 30 seconds of FaceTime and mention from Trump, and the rest is all about him. And he admits that. He says, I don't like to hold these rallies for other people. It's for me. That, of course, is his admission of the narcissistic supply that's provided by the dimwits and idiots who show up to his mob rallies. As to the 25th Amendment, there are some Republicans who are speaking up. Mick Mulvaney, who was an enabler to Trump all through the impeachment process, on the theft of money to pay for the ridiculous border wall, and many other of the transgressions of Trump's 4 years in office. He's pivoted now. He said, it doesn't surprise me at all that the 25th Amendment is being discussed. Clearly, he is not the same as he was 8 months ago. Oh, come on. He's been so consistent. The quote goes on, certainly the people advising him are not the same as they were 8 months ago, and that leads to a dangerous sort of combination as you saw yesterday. Oh, Mick, are you saying that Mark Meadows is more rabid and more dangerous than you were as a Trump enabler? And Bill Barr, he's a rat who got off the sinking ship just in time. He issued a statement to the AP. The president's actions were a betrayal of his office and supporters, and that orchestrating a mob to pressure Congress is inexcusable. But here's the guy who played Trump's lawyer and the top legal beagle in the country. He didn't mention any criminal remedies or any sanctions of Trump, even a censure, which is the slap on the wrist that Congress can issue. And they had talked about censure over the perfect phone call last week to Brad Raffensperger, where the president replayed his role in the Ukraine scandal, tried to brush back this, rube, in his view. And Raffensperger is a rube. He's also quite a hypocrite. And when I saw John King of CNN talk about how great Raffensperger has been, well, since the election, he appears to have operated in a relatively respectable way. But Greg Palast will not let us forget that Raffensperger presided over the removal of almost 200,000 Georgia voters. And, of course, Trump invoked that in the mob rally on Monday night and again in his speech in Washington yesterday, prior to the mob invasion of the Capitol. His litany of complaints about the election in Georgia, all of which were very factually rebutted by Gabriel Sterling, who is the number 2 to Raffensperger, the Secretary of State's office in Georgia. we also have to acknowledge that Mike Pence, who has been a toady, a complete bootlicker, ass-kisser, subservient, passive enabler of Trump, he recognized that this would be fatal to whatever political future he imagines if he did Trump's bidding and hijacked the ceremonial proceedings of January 6th to install Trump and himself for a second term despite losing the election. So in this final defining moment, Pence referenced his oath and that it was before God, and we know he is a God-fearing Hoosier. And it was a step too far for him to continue to perform as the marionette to Trump as he has for the past 4 years. We also have to note the catharsis that struck yesterday. And before the mob invasion of the Capitol, Mitch McConnell, in the first proceedings in the Senate, related to the challenge of the electoral votes from Arizona, he pivoted like a ballerina, like a figure skater. And suddenly, Mitch McConnell was a man of the Constitution, even though he subverted it for Trump just a year ago in the impeachment proceedings and the stonewalling that enabled Trump to survive despite it. McConnell said, well, this election wasn't even that close. But he wasn't willing to say that a month ago. He didn't publicly challenge any of Trump's ravings about the rigged election. He would just say, well, the president's within his rights to pursue recounts and legal remedies. And the other guy who gets an Emmy or an Oscar, whatever acting award you prefer, is Lindsey Graham. He was playing golf with Trump a weekend or two ago down in Florida. And he was right there saying that, Rudy Giuliani is a respectable guy and that there's so much evidence of fraud. And he spoke after the Capitol was restored. And I watched very carefully a 6-minute spiel from him where he diverted attention from his own transgressions and ultimately declared that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will be inaugurated 2 weeks from yesterday. So Joe Biden, who, as you know, I didn't support, I have serious misgivings about the team that he has assembled, for the most part, and the milquetoast agenda that he plans to pursue, the risk of new wars under Joe Biden because of the advisors that he has appointed who were part of the problem related to the invasion of Iraq, and the more, how can I put it, the wars with better optics that occurred under President Obama. To bring back Tony Blinken, to really embrace the same advisors who have given Joe Biden a lot of bad advice over the years. Well, you know my position. But I have to say that in remarks that he delivered on Wednesday demanding that Trump go on TV and tell his mob to stand down, And then remarks that he delivered today before he announced his pick for Attorney General, Judge Merrick Garland, the one who Mitch McConnell snubbed when Obama appointed him to the Scalia Supreme Court seat in February of 2016. Well, I think that overall, picking Garland, who does have support on both sides of the aisle, his background as a judge, his background at the Justice Department, they all bolster his role as somebody who, as Biden put it today, will restore the legitimacy of the Justice Department. And I applaud the words of Joe Biden. He said that Garland will be the people's lawyer. Quote, "You won't work for me. You are not the president or the vice president's lawyer. Your loyalty is not to me, it's to the law, the Constitution, the people of this nation, to guarantee justice." Those are great words. And there were more good words uttered by Joe Biden in the press event where he introduced Merrick Garland as his nominee for Attorney General. And he used his granddaughter Finnegan as the source for his knowledge that many Americans viewed yesterday. And the point's been made that if black activists or anti-war protesters had gone into the Capitol the way these white Trump supporters did, that the outcome would have been very different. I mean, it's not lost on me, I'm not the only one noticing this, that they didn't arrest a single person who had broken into the Capitol. And now they're saying, oh, we've arrested 15 since, and we're posting videos and pictures of people. Here's a hotline, a text number for people to turn them in. Why did they release them en masse? That's really curious. At any rate, Biden said that his granddaughter Finnegan texted him on Wednesday showing a picture of law enforcement officials lined up on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial during the Black Lives Matter protest last summer. And Biden said his granddaughter told him the difference wasn't fair. And Joe chimed in, "You can't tell me that if it had been a group of Black Lives Matter protesting yesterday, they wouldn't have been treated very differently than the mob of thugs that stormed the Capitol. We all know that is true, and it is totally unacceptable, totally unacceptable. The American people saw it in plain view." Well, I commend Biden for those comments. But when the case of Hunter Biden comes before the Attorney General, whether to pursue further investigation, and I believe it's likely that such an investigation would turn up criminal behavior, or at least law-breaking behavior, by Joe Biden's son. And will Merrick Garland maintain his independence? Will he be seen as fully neutral in any case that involves Hunter Biden? I'm not sure. And in this the show file for today's podcast, I'm putting up a link to an article by our friend Peter Van Buren, former State Department officer, who I don't share all of his views. Peter has moved into a kind of bizarre zone where he often defends Donald Trump or normalizes his behavior in his writing and in his commentary on social media. But in a piece that was published last week at the American Conservative, Peter Van Buren writes, "I read the files on Hunter Biden's laptop. They paint a sleazy picture of multi-million-dollar wire transfers, potential money laundering, and possible tax evasion. They raise serious questions about the judgment and propriety of Jim Biden, Joe's brother, and Joe himself. Call it smoke, not fire, but smoke that should not be ignored." And I think that this is a very fair report that tries to remedy some of the the malpractice of the corporate media as they closed ranks back in October. And sure, Rudy Giuliani surfaced the Hunter Biden laptop as an October surprise. But the media suppressed coverage of it. And there are, I think, important questions about Hunter's connections in China and to what extent those, either implicitly or otherwise, involved Biden, or at least the perception that Hunter could provide access to him. So I encourage you to read this piece because I think this is an issue that's not going to go away. And even though Mitch McConnell is moving to the back of the chamber, he will be the minority leader. He is an excellent obstructionist. And he'll go through the motions of unifying and, kumbaya around the inauguration. Maybe he'll wait till that caucus lunch in the middle of the afternoon on January 20th to reprise his comments from 2009 when he promised to make Obama a one-term president and to block him every step of the way. McConnell's obstructionism predated Trump. Trump just gave him incredible cover to operate with raw power and little accountability. And even though McConnell's wife, the transportation secretary in the Trump administration, Elaine Chao, has become the first cabinet member to resign in protest of yesterday's mob actions incited by Trump, in some ways, that diminishes her potential role in invoking the 25th Amendment. She's going to duck that, even as she takes a principled stand and rejects the mentor who made her transportation secretary, allowed her to bring home a lot of pork to Kentucky, allowed her to dodge the intriguing allegations about how she and Mitch had become wealthy from her parents' Chinese-based shipping line. So the hypocrisy of this moment knows no bounds. When you look at McConnell, you look at his wife, you look at Lindsey Graham, and all these others who are now posturing as deeply opposed to the violence that they saw. But can they name the man who instigated it? So far, that answer is no. So there are a few other people who've left in protest. Stephanie Grisham, former White House press secretary who's been chief of staff to Ms. Melania. Ricky Niceta, White House social secretary. John Costello, a senior cybersecurity official. A lawyer who is filing specious cases for the Trump campaign in Pennsylvania has stepped down. He's withdrawn, saying that he had been used to perpetuate a crime. That is Jerome Marcus. Well, these people have suddenly found principles, morals, and selective outrage. We're going to see that a lot from Republicans in the coming weeks and months. We're also going to see a lot of posturing about election integrity. Many of you are familiar with Paul Leto. He's been trained in the law. He's been an election integrity activist going back to 2004. And in, I don't know what you call it, it's a Google shared page where a lot of election integrity activists post, run by our friend Ray Lutz from San Diego. Paul Leto has been like Paul Revere. He was warning that Trump may try to use and abuse the January 6 pro forma process to hijack the election. And that was sure his intention. And with Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley in the Senate, there was at least an intention. Now, before the mob picture developed yesterday, Ted Cruz spoke in the Arizona challenge and said all he wanted was a commission, a 10-day commission to review this election. And he explicitly said he was not about setting aside the election. But Ted Cruz lies as often as you blow your nose. And I'm sure he's got an entire rewrite of this episode ready to pop on us as soon as he gets the chance. Now, one of the other factors, in addition to the phone call to Brad Raffensperger, where Trump bullied him, appeared to break the law by trying to, threaten him unless he came up with the 11,000 plus votes that he needed to beat Biden in Georgia. Trump's interference by demonizing Governor Brad Kemp and the Secretary of State of Georgia certainly played a significant role in the historic Senate runoffs that propelled two Democrats, Jon Ossoff and the Reverend Raphael Warnock, into the U.S. Senate, displacing Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue. Now, I predicted back in November or December, I don't recall exactly, that Trump's meddling in Georgia, which is all about him and his fantasy that he was screwed by the Republican officials who failed to rig the election in Georgia sufficiently for Trump to win. And once the votes were counted, their hands were pretty much tied. And with the partial audit and then the full hand count that took place and a machine recount, Brad Raffensperger and his boss, Kemp, they really had no wiggle room. And as Trump sat on them, all they could do was meekly say, well, you just got the wrong information, Mr. President. These are not profiles in courage. They're profiles of desperados. And it was a pretty exciting night on Tuesday to watch the votes come in. It was quite a seesaw. You'd see the Democrats go up, and then the Republicans would catch up and take the lead. But what is so hard to process in all of this is that there's 74 million Americans who voted for Trump despite everything they know about him. And there were over 2 million Republicans in Georgia who voted for proven, corrupt members of the United States Senate. Both Loeffler and Perdue used their insider information to make stock trades, to protect themselves, or to profit from the pandemic. They prostituted themselves to Trump repeatedly, just like bobbleheads. And why? Why, Georgia? Why was it even so close? How can so many people believe the bullshit that comes out of Kelly Loeffler's mouth? Trump trotted her out on the stage at the rally in Northwest Georgia on Monday night, and she was just this little bubblehead. She pledged to challenge the Georgia electoral vote in the joint session. She did change her mind after the mob activities. And all she did was say over and over again that Warnock and Ossoff were these dangerous lefties who are going to bring socialism to America and destroy our country. There was no other message coming from Perdue or Loeffler to the voters of Georgia. And this is what we have to process. Trump is going to be escorted out of Washington, one way or the other. He wanted to go to his golf course in Scotland, but the officials in Scotland said, well, you can come, but you can't play golf. We've locked down the country. So Trump is clearly squirming. He doesn't want to show for the inauguration. And if he does, they better heavily medicate him, because who knows what he would do. But we have people, let's just look at the list of senators who voted against the Pennsylvania, voted for the Pennsylvania challenge. That would be Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, the newly minted Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville, Cindy Hyde-Smith of Mississippi, Roger Marshall of Kansas, Cynthia Loomis of Wyoming, and Rick Scott of Florida. And on the other measure, to challenge the Arizona electoral results, it was some of the same people: Hawley, Cruz, Tuberville, Hyde-Smith, Marshall, joined by John Kennedy of Louisiana. They will remain with, in the Senate. I was going to mention that Loeffler is finished. And Perdue, his term was up on Sunday, so he was not able to participate. And that's why some of the votes didn't total 100 in the Senate, because Perdue had lost his position. Now to the events of yesterday. I forced myself on several occasions over the past week to flip over to Fox, to sample One America News, to look at Newsmax. And I have to say it's frustrating because at the times I checked out One America and Newsmax, they were running pre-recorded shows featuring Rudy Giuliani talking about the rigged election. They were not live, for example, on Sunday or on Tuesday night when I tried to watch. But on Wednesday, as the 1 p.m. Eastern Time session, the joint session of Congress, was about to get underway, Fox News stayed with Trump as he was speaking to the mob rally on the Ellipse, dispatching his mob to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol. And while he didn't explicitly instruct them to break in and to harass or threaten the members or disrupt the session, they didn't need those kinds of details. And so right up to the last minute, Fox was part of the enabling of Trump. And they've already had to issue their retractions, facing lawsuits from Dominion and other people that they smeared in the careless charges of election rigging. But even today, Sean Hannity on his radio show just completely edits Trump out of it. He's outraged at these violent thugs who came to the Capitol. These are the people who he, along with, what's her name? Laura Ingraham, have been feeding lies and even suggesting actions that they could take. And so the role of the media in all this is something that cannot be put aside. And I put up a post last night on Facebook something to the effect of, look what it took for Twitter to finally suspend Trump. And it appears they may extend that. Facebook announced today that Trump will not be permitted to post before Inauguration Day, at least. And I'm sorry, this is inexcusable. There is no First Amendment issue at Facebook or at Twitter. These are private platforms. They have standards that they have never properly enforced on Trump. I know plenty of people who've been put in Facebook jail, who've been banned from Twitter for life, for very minor violations, if at all, of their so-called community standards. But Trump was permitted to lie, to incite, to threaten, really with impunity. Oh, sure, they flagged some of his posts along the way. But these companies, along with YouTube and Google for the way it operates its search, they profited from the very damage that Trump has been doing to our country. And it really was not until the mob invaded the Capitol and a woman was killed by a Capitol police officer that they recognized the risk of permitting this unhinged actor to continue to post at will. Like all those Republicans, they will pivot and say, well, you know, free speech. And I am a real extremist when it comes to the First Amendment. But it doesn't apply at these online platforms. And so that is simply a mirage or smokescreen that is used. So I imagine Trump will take up residence at Parler. I went over there once to take a look at it, but, I don't need another social media outlet. And by the way, it was just after the first of the year that I successfully deleted my Twitter account. Boy, do I feel good about that. That's the part of my retirement plan that is really working. So one of the big questions that comes up is, how did the Capitol Police fail to prepare for what they knew was coming, even by watching television like I did between noon and 1 o'clock Wednesday, when it was clear that Trump was dispatching his mob to the Capitol? They had a pretty lame perimeter set up. They had insufficient officers to protect the not just the perimeter, but the central facets of the Capitol. And I've been into the U.S. Capitol and the Congressional and Senate office buildings dozens of times. And as an average citizen, you have to get in line, go through the metal detector. There is a security system that is set up. And it clearly failed. We have the anecdotal pictures of guards taking selfies with these illegal trespassers into the Capitol. And today, Pelosi fired the Sergeant of Arms, demanded the resignation of the chief of the Capitol Police. Schumer said that if the Sergeant of Arms of the Senate has not resigned by the time he takes the majority leader post, that he'll sack him. But I watched Mayor Muriel Bowser of Washington hold a news conference this morning where she praised the Metropolitan Police. Well, I saw them gathering for at least a couple of hours before they moved in to back up the beleaguered Capitol Police yesterday. We know that Trump refused to call out the National Guard, and for some reason Mike Pence did it. I don't believe he has the authority to do that, but he did it. The Pentagon responded. But even last night, as I was watching the exterior video, I didn't see a strong National Guard presence. At any rate, the Washington, D.C. police lined up like there was a donut truck just out of camera view and didn't do diddly until several hours after the Capitol had been breached. So this will lead to investigations and probably more firings. But it shows just how ill-prepared our government is for fairly predictable developments. As part of the phony and selective outrage from Republicans and right-wing media, they immediately introduced the dodge that, there were Antifa people who had infiltrated the Trump mob and that they were the ones responsible for really leading the outrageous behavior at the Capitol yesterday. It started in a tweet from Matt Gaetz, the right-wing nut from Florida and a deep Trump supporter. Quote, pretty compelling evidence from a facial recognition company that he said showed that some of the people who breached the Capitol were not Trump supporters. They were masquerading as Trump supporters and, in fact, were members of the violent terrorist group Antifa. Now, the bullshit detector goes off right away because Antifa is not an organized group. It doesn't have any members. It's a concept that shows up when certain individuals, self-styled, decide to confront what they consider to be fascism. So this was promoted not just by Gaetz, but the Fox News channel picked it up. I heard Sean Hannity talking about it today. So the Washington Post delved into this, and Philip Bump and Dalton Bennett write, the genesis for the assertion appears to be an article published by the right-wing Washington Times that claimed that a retired military officer had provided information from a firm called XR Vision that used facial recognition software to identify several people who invaded the Capitol, and the two of them were linked to Antifa. A third was someone who shows up at climate and Black Lives Matter protests in the West, and from the right wing, they're all the same, right? So the company pushed back. XR Vision didn't generate any composites or detection imagery for the Washington Times, nor for a retired military officer, said its CEO. What happened, he explained, was that the firm performed an analysis on the footage and was able to identify 3 people. We concluded that 2 of them were affiliated with the Maryland skinheads and the National Socialist movements. These 2 are known Nazi organizations. They are not Antifa. The third individual identified was an actor with some QAnon promotion history. Again, no Antifa identification was made for him either. And one of the composites that's been floating around on social media, promoted by the apologists for Trump, includes a photograph of 2 people that can be found on the website of Philly Antifa. But they are there because Philly Antifa believes they are fascists. So facts don't matter. Give me a shred of truthiness. Give me something I can call evidence. And a savvy right-wing propagandist can turn it into a diversion for Trump and Trumpists. Well, there's an interesting opinion piece in today's Washington Post under the byline of failed neocon Max Boot. And to his credit, he did become an outspoken critic of Trump over the past couple of years. And he is calling Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, to account here. He said, together with Trump, they have led Republicans to disaster, and they must go. He quotes a comment from Lindsey Graham back in 2016, If we nominate Trump, we will get destroyed and we will deserve it. And Boot adds the GOP is finally getting what it deserves. Well, these people are such skilled actors and propagandists. We saw that Lindsey Graham had a hard-fought re-election effort challenged by Jamie Harrison, who raised $80 million and was unable to defeat Graham. Well, he's got a fresh 6-year term. So he's going to rebrand himself as a constitutionalist. In his speech on the Senate floor yesterday, he talked about how he believes in the courts, and when the courts ruled against Trump, including Trump-appointed judges, he didn't agree with them, but he accepts them. Back to Max Boot. Republicans have no one but themselves to blame for allowing this autocratic buffoon, Trump, to hijack their party. They could have stood up to him during the past 4 years as he committed one offense against our democracy after another, from spending money that Congress didn't appropriate on a border wall we don't need, to using congressionally appropriated aid to attempt to blackmail Ukraine's president into helping him politically. But Republicans chose to either ignore Trump, his transgressions, or to assist them. So it's an interesting piece. I've linked to it in the show file for the podcast. He writes, "It is unlikely to happen under the current congressional leadership, which has been a profile in cowardice. Kevin McCarthy and Minority Whip Steve Scalise voted with the authoritarian extremists by refusing to certify Electoral College outcome. McConnell opposed efforts to challenge certification, as he explained in a speech on Wednesday, but it's too little, too late. He spent the past 4 years as Trump's wingman. McConnell and McCarthy have brought dishonor and defeat to the Republican Party. Both men need to go if there's to be any hope of redemption for the GOP." Joe Lauria offered a good commentary, a brief one, over at Consortium News today, and I'm going to keep this to domestic issues, but I do applaud coverage by Consortium News that the mainstream actually followed suit with this time on the announcement that Julian Assange will not be extradited from Great Britain to the United States. Judge Baratzer, in a terrible ruling, upheld all of the false notions that were advanced by the lawyers for the U.S. government in the proceedings back in September and October, but then surprised supporters of Assange by saying that the conditions in U.S. prisons would likely lead to a suicide by Assange, and therefore she would not grant extradition. And when Assange's lawyers asked to apply for bail on Monday, she said, no, dot your I's, cross your T's, and come back on Wednesday, where she then denied bail for Assange. It is cruel. And I applaud the coverage at Consortium News, if you haven't followed it. But Lauria writes, by the time yesterday's events were over, it was clear what had not happened. It wasn't a coup. It wasn't an insurrection. It had nothing to do with Putin, China, or Iran. It wasn't like Pearl Harbor, as Chuck Schumer ridiculously tried to call it. It wasn't the storming of a temple of democracy, interrupting Congress' sacred duty, or desecrating the hallowed halls of the Capitol. Such quasi-religious rhetoric inflates the self-importance of officials, elevating themselves above the people they are supposed to serve. It was not the storming and occupation of the Japanese embassy in Lima, Peru in '96, or the 1985 seizure of the Palace of Justice in Bogota, Colombia. It was in some ways the downtrodden forcing their existence into the faces of an elitist Congress who serve very powerful interests instead. But it was also the delusive manipulation of desperate people by Donald Trump, a master manipulator who for his own interests has somehow convinced millions of Americans that he is their champion, whose re-election was stolen from them, even when it is doubtful their lives were much improved over the past 4 years. And finally today, I want to share an exchange that I had with a young friend over the holidays. And my young friend is a computer security specialist. He's a bright guy, and he and I agreed that Russiagate was largely a concoction, and that fundamentally there was never any evidence that Russia hacked the DNC. That episode appears to have radicalized my friend. It led him to doubt the mainstream media, with good reason. It led him not to trust the Democrats, promoters of Russiagate, with good reason as well. And while he is not an out-and-out MAGA hat-wearing Trump supporter, it's very clear in our exchange, first by phone and then trading lengthy emails, that he has been deeply influenced by Trump's propaganda and outright lies. And so my friend and I went through a litany of the claims made by Trump and Giuliani that there were more votes cast than registered voters in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. That's not true. That Antrim County, Michigan, had this bizarre episode that was immediately debunked. That dead people voted. And, the other issues that have been raised. He also did a mathematical analysis of voter turnout historically and in 2020. And he claims that shows that it was not a fair election. He also blames China, and he is deeply concerned about the reported hack, which he thinks may have been used to deny Trump votes in certain jurisdictions. He sent me links to videos, one hosted by a guy named Tim Pool, who's a very smart guy. He can reel off all kinds of figures, and he sees China as the actor who has denied Trump re-election. And then there was a guy, what is his name? Matt Brainerd, the so-called Voter Integrity Fund. Brainerd has been working for Trump for 5 or 6 years. The Voter Integrity Fund is a captive organization to Trump. And in the opening sequence of the Matt Brainerd video, he admits that the dead voter claims are false. But then he goes into a whole spiel about vote harvesting schemes. We know that those have been used by Republicans. The evidence is North Carolina, Congressional District 10. And my friend even embraced Sidney Powell, the shit show lawyer, who has been making incredible claims using innuendo and evidence that she's just about to produce but never quite does. Also, he sent me documents that came from Sidney Powell that attempt to link Joe Biden and the whole China thing to the Dominion voting machine company, which is so amateurish that it makes a claim that Governor Gavin Newsom of California is Nancy Pelosi's nephew. That is simply not true. And it makes the claim that because Cerberus, which is an equity fund that George H.W. Bush used to be involved with, it owns a lot of military assets, it's an investor in Dominion. And that is used to link to HSBC Bank, and they're back to China. And I wrote to my friend, I said, since Cerberus invested in Dominion and in the supermarket company Safeway, is Safeway part of the election rigging? So, as I wrap up here, thanks for indulging me. I have not yet put together my alert list of all the people I said I would alert when I did a podcast, so if you can do me a favor and share this with friends who you know are listeners to the PBC podcast, put it up on Facebook or Twitter. I'm not on Twitter anymore. Anything you can do to share this with others, I will very much appreciate. And I don't know when I will return here. This was just a a one-off, as far as I know. But as we see the change of the guard occur, we must continue to be skeptical of both the left and the right. The corporate interests that are now driving up the stock market because Trump is on his way out, well, they are heavily invested in the Democrats as well. Janet Yellen, we now know, took $7 million in Wall Street speaking fees, including nearly $1 million from Citibank alone. It's the Hillary model. So I encourage you to remain vigilant. Don't let MSNBC lead you into becoming a Democratic cheerleader. If they actually can pass legislation to give hungry Americans and those who are facing imminent foreclosure or eviction, if they can provide relief, I fully support it. But be wary of the corporate influences and the bad advice of many of the counselors and consultants that Biden is surrounding himself with. Thanks for listening to this special podcast. And I'll let you know that retirement's going pretty well. I love not having a deadline and sleeping in almost every day. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.